Hello and welcome to everyone to this session of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm Ghassan Moazin, an assistant professor at the Institute, and I'm today also joined by my colleague, Dr. John Wong. Today, we are very glad to welcome to the webinar Professor Carles Brasó Broggi of the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. Who will be presenting some of his new work. I think he will be familiar to many of you through his work on Chinese business history, which has been published widely in journals like Modern Asian Studies and so on. And I think many of you will have also read his 2016 book, Trade and Technology Networks in the Chinese Textile Industry, which has also been widely cited and used. And so we are doubly kind of interested in hearing today about his new research. The title of his talk is China Engineers Limited, a hybrid company in wartime China, 1937 to 1945. Before I hand things over to Carles, I should just briefly mention or explain rather the format of the talk. So we'll have roughly half an hour of presentation as usual, followed by roughly half an hour of Q&A. If you have any questions or comments for Professor Broggi, please just submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom. And then during the Q&A, I will read them out for Professor Broggi, and he can then get back to you. But I don't want to take up any more time. So Carles, if you are ready, please feel free to get started.
No, thank you very much, Ghassan, and thank you also, John, for inviting me to this webinar. I think it's a wonderful platform for business history of China and Chinese business history, and I'm very glad and honored to be here. I would also like to thank all of you, all the participants in this webinar who are attending it, and I hope that you will find it interesting. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and see if I can show my slides here. Okay, is it all right, John?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to talk here in this talk about China Engineers, and this is a company who started in 1928 and ended up in the early 1970s. And hopefully this is going to turn into a book about the company. But in this webinar, I'm going to focus on a particular period, which is the wartime period between 1937 and 1945, because I think this is the part I know better. So let me introduce a little bit the brief chronology and an introduction of the company. China Engineers was founded in 1928 as a Hong Kong company in the Register of Hong Kong, but its main office was in Shanghai. So you have a register in Hong Kong at the Hong Kong Public Record Office, but also the office which was registered in Shanghai, and the main economic activity taking place there. So this is the sources I've been able to work on. Also, at the early years of their operations, the company published a newsletter, which was called the China Engineers Quarterly Review, which continued all the existence of the company until the early 1960s, and it gives a very interesting insights about the company's economic activities, very comprehensive and complete. So this is another source that I've been working with, and actually, I have to recognize that this is something that I've done research about before. You mentioned the book of Trade and Technology Networks, which I focused on Chinese companies, but also China Engineers appeared. But this literature has to be, in my opinion, especially the literature that I dealt with the China Engineers, I am revisiting and revising it because I have found a new source, a new primary source, which is the diaries of William Charles Commercial, which is the director and founder of this company from the 1940s until the passing away of Commercial in 1960. Here I have to thank Elizabeth Commercial, the daughter of Commercial, who kindly showed me this source, which we are actually working with nowadays. So this is something that I thought I had finished studying it, and now it has become a work in progress again. But I think it's interesting because new evidences and new things are coming up with this source, which is the Diary of Commercial, where I'm working with. The company, China Engineers, was a company of intermediate trade It was actually an importer of machinery, of textile machinery to Chinese companies. But in the years of war, it diversified its business. And this is what I'm going to talk today. So I will try to explain how the company transitioned from being a transnational company working in the sphere of the international concessions until becoming a kind of a post-war Hong Kong-based multinational doing diversified service operations. So if you move forward in the post-war period, we see how business activities of China engineers moved to Hong Kong in the late 1940s, and here we have new sources, especially in Hong Kong. Even though the office of Shanghai was one of the last companies to maintain business activities in the 1950s until 1956. This is the moment where all business private activities were controlled by the Communist Party, and thus Shanghai office was detached from China engineers as the main economic activity moved from Shanghai to Hong Kong. However, China engineers thrived in the 1950s in the trade in Hong Kong as an intermediate trader until the passing away of William Charles Gomersal in 1960. And we will see that this company was heavily dependent on the personality of William Charles Gomersal. So when he passed away, the economic activity continued for a while, but finally China engineers was sold to a Malayan group and disappeared from the scene. So this is a brief overview of China engineers. And now I would like to discuss briefly also about why I consider China engineers a hybrid company. First of all, we need to understand the origins of William Charles von Gomersal. And this is also why this new source of his diaries appear to be important. Gomersal was born in London in 1895 from a Chinese father, Fung Ho Wong, which was a tea merchant, and a British woman, Elizabeth Gomersal. And due to the racist rules of the British communities in China, frowning on interracial marriages, especially between British women and Chinese men, Elizabeth gave birth in England and brought the young boy an English education. And he studied textile engineering until he moved back to China in 1918. He worked for several other British companies until he founded China Engineers in 1928. So if you take a look at the shareholders of China Engineers, we discover also a mix of British, Chinese, and other Asian investors. In this table, on the right-hand side, we can see the names and occupations of the shareholders during the first years of the company. All investors were men, except for the mother of William, Elizabeth Gomersal. And the main investor was
Carlos.
Yes.
Sorry, I think your slides are not moving. We are still on the first.
On the first one. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought. Okay, if I do this, it's okay now or not?
No, I think we're still.
Okay. So I'm.
Now we can see the table.
So I will then keep it here like this, right?
Okay.
So yeah, I will not do it. So now you can see the photo of Gomersal and the table of shareholders. Okay.
Yeah.
So you can see William Charles Gomersal in bold letters at the beginning, the main shareholder. But then you see the hybrid character of this company. The second shareholder of the company was the American Asiatic Underwriters. This is the first company of Cornelius van der Star, which would later become AIG. But at that time, it was a small American company in Shanghai. But then you can see a lot of Chinese merchants, which also were shareholders of China Engineers. We can see, for instance, the James Xiong Li, Li Shuxiong, and Philip Li in the number 15 and 20 of the shareholder list. These were brothers from a very wealthy Ningbo merchant family residing in Shanghai. Philip Li, that you can see in bold letters, was nominated office director of the Shanghai office, while James Xiong Li would become the director of China Engineers once Gomersal died in 1960. And then you in bold letters, you see Gomersal, Philip Li, and Eric Shaftesbury Elliston, which was also a member of the executive board who actually managed the office of Shanghai. So actually, the office of Shanghai was pretty balanced between an Eurasian director, William Gomersall, British trader, Eric Elliston, and Chinese engineer, Philip Lee. Besides this presence of American, British, Eurasian, and Chinese capital, you see also small shareholders coming from South Asia, such as the last shareholder, which came from British India, and also a member of the Tata family in the number 13, Bejan Dadaboy Tata. So actually, this is why I call this company a hybrid company, because maybe legally it was a British company, but geographically actually it was a Chinese company because it did not have any presence in Britain. And sociologically, it was clear a company which was based from this cosmopolitan society and transnational members from different places of origin. Okay, so now I'm going to show my next slide. Do you see it? Yeah. Okay. So what was the core business of China Engineers? China Engineers were importers of machinery from Europe mainly to Chinese customers. So they were importing intermediate goods for the textile industry, for the Chinese textile industry. They purchased spindles from the UK, looms from Switzerland, dyes for the chemical industry, for the dyeing industry from Germany, wool derivatives from Australia, and so on. And the main customers of China Engineers were big textile industrial groups of Chinese capital. Let's say Dafeng from the Wang Qiyu family, which we have seen in the shareholder list. Li Xin from the Tang family of Wuxi. Shenxin, maybe the most famous one, from the Rong brothers from Wuxi. And Dacheng from Changzhou, owned by Liu Guojun. So they purchased machinery in Europe and they imported it to China. And what was the competitive advantage of China Engineers? So besides the familiarity of the Chinese networks, because we see that there were Chinese shareholders there, China Engineers had a competitive advantage in the payment terms of this machinery. As you can see in the contract of China Engineers to the Chinese company Li Xin, signed in 1932, that was a purchase order of 60 looms. And the interesting thing here was the payment terms. So there's a lot of literature in the Chinese textile industry that has said that one of the most difficult things of the development of Chinese industrialization was the lack of capital and the fact that Chinese companies had difficulties in finding capital, and then got involved in high interest loans and so on. No? So when a Chinese company wanted to buy machinery, a very important thing was the payment terms. Some companies, like competitor companies of China Engineers, had demanded the Chinese customer to pay a first installment after the signature of the contract that could be 15-20% of the machinery cost, and then another installment at the arrival of goods at ports. And here in this contract of China Engineers, we can see that the payment terms is 15% at the arrival of goods at ports, so no payment when the signing of the contract. And then an installment structure of after 6 months of the arrival of goods at ports, you find installments of every 6 months. That was very, very positive or very advantageous for Chinese companies, but also risky business for Chinese. And this is something that during the war had a lot of consequences. Okay. Besides this this is the core business of China Engineers and one of the competitive advantages of this company. Besides that, the company also displayed services for private companies, service fees for installing factories, or to governments, to the Shanghai municipal government, to the Ningbo regional government, and other service for engineering services. According to this newsletter of China Engineers 1934, the company ranked 6th in the market of engineering services in China. Besides the top companies, which were maybe Jardine Matheson Engineering Company and so on, we can also find companies similar in this hybrid character I just mentioned to China Engineers, such as the Arnhold company and other companies, which were, for instance, Arnhold was also run by the Sassoon family, which had also a kind of similar hybrid structure. So now we move to the war period, and we see how China Engineers evolved from this core business of importing machineries to other sectors, especially in industry, in finance, and in trade. First of all, we will start in industry. So in the summer 1937, when the battle of between China and Japan started, it entered Shanghai very quickly. In the summer, August 1937, war clashed in the region of Shanghai. But it clashed especially in the region which was administered by the Chinese authorities, while the international concession was kept neutral. Here you can find a map of the limits of the international concession. This part on the right-hand side was the part of the international concession which remained neutral. And in the other part, you see the countries of Baoshan, Zhabei, or Caojiadu, which became affected by the war. And in colors, you find textile mills. So the textile mills that stood inside the concessions were kept untouched. They were not affected, but the ones that stayed out of the concessions received the clash of war and the occupation of Japan. And here you have a literature. We can see, the Parscobel classic of the Chinese capitalism in Japan's New World that explain the fact that some of these companies that stayed out of the concessions raised British and German flags to protect themselves against the destruction of war and the Japanese occupation. And this is basically studying also other literature, basically focusing on the Chinese companies in regards the Japanese occupation or the Chinese government. But while we focus on these intermediaries like China engineers, we see a more complex picture, which rises from the fact that most of these companies had placed orders of machineries in 1936, which had not been paid back. Because China engineers had this installment program, a lot of mills that were still staying out of the concessions and were threatened by the Japanese occupation, had machinery which had not been paid back to China engineers, and China engineers claimed this debt. Okay, so as a result, some of these Chinese companies accepted that China engineers entered into the business of their running mills, and thus, this economic rationality explain how some of these companies were actually purchased by China engineers, and thus British flags were raised, and thus China engineers claimed for protection to the British consulate against the Japanese occupation. This happened to some of the mills, and I've analyzed the case of China cotton mills in a previous chapter, but actually China engineers managed to run 7 textile mills in the international concession of Shanghai during this period. And so it did not limit to one company, it was extended to other Chinese companies, which became a kind of joint ventures between Chinese capital and China engineers who entered the business claiming for this. Okay. At the same time, in the international concession, and this is something that has been studied, there was a boom of textile production since the price of textile goods skyrocketed. And so all the companies who were able to produce textile goods were selling at a high margin. This happened on these mills like China cotton mills, who succeeded in transporting part of the machineries inside the international concession and continued to produce. That created high margins, and in this way, these companies could also pay back the debt of the machineries that had been incurred when they bought it at the beginning. Okay, so actually, China engineers turned out to have huge profits during this period, and at the same time, even though Shanghai, the international concession of Shanghai, was isolated from the rest of China, Shanghai could still import machinery, so China engineers could keep with this core business of importing machinery. And because the price of goods had been skyrocketing, especially the price of textile, yarn, and clothes, the price of machinery also was raised. So actually, China engineers could also sell machineries to other companies with high profits. So China engineers turned from being a machinery importer to entering the business of industry. But at the same time, also it expanded its business activities towards inter-Asian trade. We see in the beginning that China engineers only imported machineries for Chinese customers. Since the 1940s, Commercial created a new company with other South Asian partners which imported raw cotton from South Asia, especially British India, because international concession had been isolated from the rest of China, and before the war, these mills, a lot of these mills provided themselves from raw cotton from China. This raw cotton from China was not possible to get anymore. So Gomersal created this company to import raw cotton. At the same time, these imports of raw cotton were passing through Hong Kong. So Hong Kong became more important in the business activities of China engineers. So Gomersal started to travel a lot between Shanghai and Hong Kong. And it was at that time that Gomersal planned, and this is something that was also in line with the nationalist government guidelines, which established that textile companies who were operating at the international concessions had to, and wanted to purchase more machinery, had to pay with foreign currencies obtained through exports. So these companies started to see export markets for their cotton goods, in order to be able to have foreign currencies to buy, to purchase machinery. So in this moment, Gomersal planned a visit to Southeast Asia, a visit that finally did not realize because of the clash of the Pacific War. But other textile industrialists, and it's interesting, something that I think deserves more investigations, sought a way to develop, that China's industries could develop by a means of exporting finished goods, especially textile goods. And this is something that happened in Shanghai, in this isolated island of the international concessions, but also in Chongqing, where some of these international industrialists had also moved part of the machinery. At that time, also Chongqing was supplying itself from Burma and from Southeast Asia. So this opening of China to Southeast Asia at these years, just before the Pearl Harbor incident, I think is interesting and has not been addressed. And I just quote here two articles that appear in textile journals, one of it claiming this opening of the Chinese companies to Southeast Asia, another one of Liu Guojun, which was a customer of China engineers, who at that time moved between Chongqing, Hong Kong, and Shanghai and tried to export goods to Southeast Asia. Okay, so we move in another direction. So China engineers, evolved from being an importer of machinery to entering the industrial business, also involving in international trade, and finally also involving in finance. When we see the contract of China engineers to Li Xin of 1932, which was, how China engineers offered these installments. After the war, these installments also had a surcharge on interest rates. So because the circumstances of war, China engineers continued with this installment structure of contracts, but at the same time charging interest rates. But also Gomersal, and this is also that something that has been appearing in diaries, also obtained loans from British banks for Chinese companies. Not only Chinese companies, but also foreign companies like Swiss companies. And this is also very interesting because the Swiss companies also helped Gomersal when Gomersal was detained in a refugee camp in Hong Kong after the Pearl Harbor incident, because Swiss remained neutral during all of the conflict. So Gomersal obtained charged interest rates for machinery importers after the war, obtained loans with a surcharge on the interest rate for textile companies, and this is something we will also see when we analyze the China engineers' activities in the post-war period in Hong Kong, where China engineers also intermediated between banks, Hong Kong banks, and Chinese industrialists. Okay, and at the same time, China engineers also became an expert in asset valuation. All these companies that had to square accounts every year, taking into account inflation, the depreciation of capital, and the market price of their machineries, asked for China engineers for consultancy. So they would go to the mills and they would check the state of their machineries and also evaluated them. And that would have also an impact on the accounts of these companies. So actually, China engineers became a kind of financial consultant for a lot of textile companies. And finally, some of these companies also looking at increasing their capital to adapt it to the inflation year after year. Some of them, they also offered shares at the Shanghai Stock Exchange. And this happened in the 1940s with China Cotton Mills, but also to other mills like Shanghai Worsted Mill and so on. And I have here some quotations of Commercial itself from the diary, which states it's this growing role of China engineers as a financer. Okay, so for instance, in August 27, 1940, Commercial wrote, and I quote, "Business cycle has been remarkably successful. China engineers is only 11 years and is a powerful concern and is the focus of other important and rising enterprises. It can become a financing house to assist Chinese industry." End of quote. So China engineers in these years had found profits from this diversification of its business activity. And now we move to the last stage of the war, when actually China engineers ceased production after the harbor incident and the occupation of Japanese occupation of both the international concession first and afterwards of Hong Kong. Actually, and this is interesting because if we see 1936, when Chinese companies were purchasing machinery, I think they were not thinking that war was imminent, because otherwise they wouldn't have bought machinery. In 1941, Commercial was not thinking that the war was imminent, and he was traveling between Shanghai and Hong Kong quite often, undertaking business with Chinese customers. In Hong Kong, he also met with industrialists of Chongqing that were willing to buy machineries for Chongqing, but the transportation of these machines from Hong Kong to Chongqing was out of reach because of logistics impediments. But Commercial was traveling between Shanghai and Hong Kong when the Pearl Harbor incident occurred. He stayed in a hotel in Hong Kong, separated from his family, which stood in Shanghai. And here is when Commercial starts the second volume of his journal, which actually explains to his wife what is he doing in Hong Kong at that period. Commercial stays in the hotel while Japan occupies Hong Kong, and he is taken in January 1942 in a refugee camp, in a camp in Stanley with 200 other civilians. He stays there with other businessmen that had been stuck in Hong Kong, coming from Shanghai, like Eli Kaduri, which is also kind of personage that fits in this hybrid companies that we are analyzing. And then he pressures the Swiss consulate because he has been undertaking activities with the Swiss companies. So the Swiss consulate can intermediate to take him to Shanghai. Finally, these relations or these contacts are successful, and Commercial goes back to Shanghai in the summer of 1942. Then it's interesting because he is allowed to go to office. The office of China engineers remains open, but business is almost known. There is no business to do. So Commercial just stays in his office, reading, doing some gardening, doing some statistics, until he finally is requested or forced to go to the internment camp of Longhua. So he spends there 2 years, the 2 last years of the Second World War, where he has this 50th anniversary and where he also meets other business communities, business transnational communities of Shanghai that had been stuck in this internment camp. So this is the last stage of the war, where China engineers' activity is very, very low. But it's also it stands in contrast with the industrial concerns that had been previously participated by China engineers. Some of these companies regain activity in 1943. If they register in the Association of the Textile Owners, which belong to the occupied zone. This is an association that is run by the collaborationist government of Wang Jingwei. And some of these companies actually resume industrial activity. But and it's interesting because if the transnational character of these companies were acted as a protective shield in the first years of the war against Japan. In this period, they to be able to resume production, they have to strengthen their Chinese structure. So these companies, or some of these companies, claim that more than 90% of their shareholder list are Chinese. So they forget about this transnational side of there, and they are allowed to resume production, even though this is at a very small scale. So you see that China Cotton Mills and other companies that have been purchased by China engineers resume production in this period, but at 15-20% of pre-war production level. And it's interesting to see that pre-war production level was attained at the international concessions in 38, 39, and 40. Okay, if we see this shareholder meeting of China Cotton Mills in 1943, where this transnational structure is hidden, but their claim or they try to resume production at a very small scale, and also is scattering their machines between the international concession and the surrounding part of Shanghai. So even the first stage of war, all industry was concentrated in the international concession. In this second stage, industry was spread among small mills. Okay, so, and I'm going to come to my conclusions here, because this is something that I've been working for some time, but now I'm trying to, so if I focused on Chinese companies, now I want to focus on these intermediaries and see how the importance, because traditional economic literature tend to focus whether on Chinese companies or on foreign companies, and I think that there is a important community of in-betweeners or transnational community that did not belong to the categories that we are used to make use, and this is especially important or interesting in the shareholder structure of China engineers, where you see an Eurasian, but also other Asians, South Asians, also Baghdadi Jews, also other Europeans, like Swiss interests that intervenes in this moment of war, which do not belong in the traditional dichotomies, and these hybrid companies, in regards to their relation with the Chinese companies, during the war, the ties that maybe were weak at the beginning strengthened because of the circumstances of war, and became strong ties at the end of it. And this is also something that China engineers, I think the example of China engineers demonstrate. At the same time, it's interesting to see how the long years of war demonstrate changing attitudes or situations. And these attitudes, something are aligned, or the interests of China engineers, something are aligned with the narratives, national or colonial narratives, but sometimes are not. And this also, I think, give nuances to the explanations of the existing state of the art. And in the sense of only of the company of China engineers, and it's something that I think it helps also explaining post-war Hong Kong, and especially the participation of Hong Kong companies in world trade after the post-war, how these China engineers in this case evolved from being a hybrid kind of transnational company, that you could allocate in the sphere of the international concession, to a kind of a global service multinational that acted in different spheres or in different regions, as you can see in this newsletter of China engineers from 1957, which with head office in Hong Kong, but presence in London, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Korea, Taiwan, and even Shanghai at that time. So I don't know, that's more or less what I wanted to say, and I would like to thank you again, and maybe listen to comments and questions. I will be glad to. Thank you.
Can you hear me? I think
yes.
Yeah. My video is not quite working, but anyways, I think, oh, there I am. Yeah, thank you so much, Carlos, for the wonderful talk. I think a really fascinating case study. I think we already have a few questions, but just as a reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I'll read them out for Carlos to reply to. So I think the first question we have comes from James Wong, and he asks, or he says, thanks for your presentation. I'm curious about these companies. Was it common for companies to register in Hong Kong while running their businesses in Shanghai?
Okay. I think so they were common in this kind of companies. So companies that were acting as intermediators, especially purchasing machineries or goods from Britain and selling them in China. And I mean companies which had no presence in Britain. So these are like China engineers, but also other companies which were initiated in China. So they were not companies which were coming from Britain to do business with China, but companies of people who were already or who had been born even in Asia and wanted to have some international kind of business, to have this like headquarter company in Hong Kong, so they have all the legal aspect covered there, but also activities covering doing business activities not only in Shanghai but also in other places of China. So I think that was that was quite common in these kind of companies. But then if you take a look at all of the foreign companies in China, then you have all, of course, different kind of situations.
The next question comes from our colleague, Professor Elizabeth Sin, and she says, what was the China engineers, I guess, companies' interaction with Japanese companies in Shanghai or other parts of China?
Okay, so China engineers in the 1930s did not have business relations with Japanese companies, at least as far as I know. They were really focused on Chinese customers. And actually, at the first stage of war, they were also very strongly supporting Chinese companies, and that meant that with especially Japanese textile companies, because they were the main competitors, they have no contact. But at the same time, you see there is some documents relating China engineers with Japanese companies. I'm thinking on banks, especially Yokohama Specie Bank, also some traders. Of some products that they were needed for textile companies, but that they couldn't get from other providers. But there were minimum contacts. Of course, after the war, there were contacts between China engineers and but not with Japanese companies, but with Japanese authorities. So China engineers engaged with a long lawsuit for the machineries and with for claiming their rights. Of course, they had to contact very often with the Japanese authorities, and in the diary and the journals you find that how Commercial is talking to some Japanese officials, etc., trying to defend the rights, and sometimes these relations are smooth, sometimes they are not very forthcoming, but the relations were against Japanese administration, not as much as with Japanese companies.
Yeah, interesting. Just to follow up on that, given the hybrids or the I guess cosmopolitan structure of the shareholders, do you know whether they ever considered taking on Japanese or giving, not necessarily to the Japanese government, but getting in Japanese investors so that I don't know, they could have more insight or more influence with the Japanese authorities?
I have not found any shareholder. What the thing I find, and this is something that it's especially in the last stages, in the last years of war, is I guess they were managers, Japanese managers, but they were also engineers who entered these companies. And some of them stayed in the late 1940s. So you see, like in 47, 48, some Japanese names in some of the documents of the Shanghai textile mills. So I guess they entered the business at the beginning of the occupation, and somehow they stayed, and somehow they maintained a relationship with these Chinese companies, and they even stayed until 1949. This is something I think Koji Hirata has analyzed. I think I remember in a Twitter he said that there were some engineers in Shanghai 1949, and I think that there were some of these ones. So this is the names I've been able to find. But they did not became shareholders. Maybe managers. Maybe they had a salary and they became like factory manager. Because they were able factory managers. They had experience in the textile business, and they stayed. So this is the things that comes to my mind.
Yeah, interesting. There's the next question from Professor Brasó, another colleague. So he says, is the total of 50,000 capital on the shareholder table indicating the number of shares or amount of yuan? If total capital was 50,000 yuan, that seems to be very modest in Shanghai around 1930. For example, the total capital of the Shanghai Commercial Press was 5 million. Or would it be common for the engineering companies to have a small capital?
Okay, we can, if you want, we can go back to the slide.
Sure.
So 500,000, there were shares who were issued for the Shanghai Stock Exchange, and there were the new shares who were put to the public, to buy. But this went along also with a capital increase of China Cotton Mills to adapt. So here you can see. Okay.
Yeah, we can see
500,000 shares,
yeah.
Chinese national dollars, 30 million. Well, it's a little bit small. But this is the new shares who were put to the Shanghai Stock Exchange. And there were the old shares, which were also increased in value with bonus. So the capital increase of the company would be adapted to the inflation of the moment. And these shares were, and I have a quote that I had not read it, were totally, and this so the market was only open for half an hour. And it was totally, oversubscribed during the period. I have a quotation, if you are interested here, of a journal, and saying that actually that was totally purchased at the moment and within this first half an hour. But these 500,000 were shares. Okay, the value at the moment of the sales were, okay, it's here. 10 Chinese dollars each. Yeah.
But doesn't it say that it's 30 that the share capital is 30 million Chinese national dollars? I mean, this is in 1941, obviously, but
no, this is a part of it.
Yeah.
Part of it that is put on the stock exchange.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I don't know if I answered because.
Sure, thank you. One thing I wanted to also ask about is this whole idea of this being a hybrid company. The fact that we have shareholders from of different nationalities, in a sense, one could say, is not that new, right? I mean, we have the HSBC famously had a very multinational array of shareholders, and also we have, of course, already in the 19th century this phenomenon that Chinese investors would invest in foreign companies. So how would you do you want to differentiate this particular company from what we kind of see before? Because for me, one key question would be to what extent this kind of multinational characteristic was also reflected in the actual management, because I think that is something, for example, the HSBC is in a sense very, cosmopolitan in terms of its shareholders. But it's still the British, basically, in the end, that are in charge at the top level. And in the case, as far as I know, of the companies, of Chinese companies or foreign companies where you have Chinese investment, it's also the foreigners still keep on managing. So, but that's just a thought.
No, that's a very good point. Actually, at the beginning, Chinese engineers, and I also look at the diary, is a very British company, actually, in the way they managed and in the newsletter. In English and the board and so on, but I think that in this case, and I don't know if this is maybe extrapolable to other companies, but the fact that they entered companies that had been previously 100% Chinese, they in a certain way they forced, especially Commercial, but also other members of the company to enter into a Chinese business, which had been previously managed by in a Chinese way. So you know, have the meetings of the minutes of the board of directors or the shareholder meetings all in Chinese, following systems of account which were typical Chinese. You know, you have the Zhizhufa, the 4-column system, which is totally different from the accounting system of China engineers. But they, in a certain way, became familiar with that, and in this way, I'm not saying that they merged the management systems of Chinese and British, but they adopted a kind of a hybrid management system in a way that these purchases of Chinese companies who would have been very problematic in the moment of war were successful in the sense that both the British, so Chinese and China engineers as purchaser of these companies, and the Chinese shareholders, which in a certain way had agreed to have this new partner to enter the business, were satisfied with the result. So that strategy in a certain way was a really successful protective shield. So after the war, when Gomersal, you know, leaves the Longhua imprisonment camp, he meets with all these Chinese industrialists, and they all received him like he was a savior. And maybe, I mean, if this hybrid strategy would not have been successful, or would only have been focused on British, you know, management being imposed to Chinese companies, I guess that, you know, when he was out, they wouldn't have had this attitude towards him. That's my impression. So this is why I think that there was a real, you know, mixture and hybridity, especially in this period where, you know, they were forced to be merged.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I jump in with a question?
Yeah.
Well, so great story. Is certainly an exciting period and a very transnational story. I wonder if we can separate the presumed nationality of the investors and operators from their location. It is a transnational story and a very exciting period, not just because of Japanese occupation of the various locations, but also you have the various powers relinquishing their extraterritorial rights in some locations, say Hong Kong. So I wonder if their repositioning actually took advantage of that to a certain extent. I mean, that's something that becomes quite murky because you have Japanese control of Hong Kong soon after, or right around that time as well. And things didn't quite become clear until past 1945. But if we were to separate that and to think about the mobility of these various transnational people and their very flexible way of defining their citizenship or nationality at various locations, I wonder if we can read even more into the situation at that time.
Yes, for sure. I mean, yeah, in some way that you can find also criticism against Gomersal, especially from British Chamber of Commerce, and also from calling him opportunistic, no, because he seems to be, you know, and also for Chinese that, you know, also partnered with him. But I think that if we try to understand how these societies, especially Hong Kong, but also the international concession worked at the moment, it was something very, very usual and not very problematic for them, I guess. I also comes to my mind the case of Baghdadi Sephardic Jews who also claim Spanish nationality because there was a law. They were Sephardic Jews, but there was a law in Spanish government to nationalize in 1929, I think it was, Sephardic Jews. So they took Spanish nationality, but only because there was a Spanish consulate who could, in a certain way, they had some legal problems, could act on their behalf, but they had never been to Spain, you know. And this is, I think, a similar point of this. And it also had to do with this kind of semi-colonial status of China, right? Where there was, of course, there was this powerful, imperial powers, you know, with exercising strong pressure in upon China, but there was also small other communities coming from other parts, which did not have such a power, but they had this, and they had to play this kind of intermediary role, and maybe Eurasians, but also other. I'm thinking on European small countries, like, I don't know, like people from Eastern Europe or people from Latin America also who were there. The number, in quantitative terms, the number was not very high. But of course, their situation is not very, does not fit very well in these dichotomies, no? And I don't know if it's what you are trying to say, or.
Well, yeah, definitely. But I think in addition to the flexible ways in which they define their nationality and resort to different, I don't know, political regimes to support their business causes, I'm wondering how these business operators avail themselves of different jurisdictions, especially in the middle of such chaos. In terms of foreign shopping or whatnot, when the world is getting redefined around them. And I guess that's something that I wonder about in the post-war reconstruction of Hong Kong. So post-45, how did they think about Hong Kong as a British colony when the other locations, the treaty ports, were no longer operating under the same rules? So I wonder about that a bit. So it's just something that puzzles me a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any? Oh, do we have another question? It seems. Billy So adds, I guess, that there were cases of prominent Eurasians in Hong Kong being treated by Europeans as Chinese and by Chinese as Europeans. What was the case in the case of Gomersal?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think Gomersal was. So he and that was the point in having him educated in Britain by his mother, who stayed in China at that moment, was more British than other maybe Eurasians that did not have the chance to go to Britain and get educated in Britain and so on. So I think in that case, Gomersal was more British than other Eurasians, even though I think in the British community everywhere, everybody knew that he was an Eurasian. So that's something that. It's not, it's not speaking, it's not public, but everyone is like under the ground, right? And actually, in the biography of Gomersal is also very, very interesting how it's not something that we are working on now, but at the beginning, his feelings are very British oriented, and at the same time, the war also changed a little bit his attitude, and he is in 1945, 1946, he's especially critic with the British community, and also engages in conflicts with other British, relevant businessmen of the British Chamber of Commerce and so on, who claim like this kind, they want to move, to recover the pre-war state. And Gomersal is, very, very clear in seeing that this is not going to be back like the moment of pre-war, and is very, very more aligned with the Chinese side actually. So actually he becomes more Chinese, I think, in his late period, and this is so. But I'm not. I don't know if this is something of him, a particularity of him, or can be also, or is representative of the rest of the Eurasian community, which unfortunately I've not been able to investigate too much.
Yeah, thank you. We've got another question from Professor Parks-Coble, who himself has, of course, written a lot about this period. He asks, does the diary reflect on the issue of his identity as a Eurasian, particularly after he was interned?
Yes. He doesn't speak about his father, as far as I know. But it is handwritten, so it's a work in progress that we are working with his daughter. So I have not read all, and it's something that parts are very, very blurry. But as far as I know, he doesn't refer to his father, but he refers himself as British. But he studies Chinese. He talks and he's very close to his Chinese friends. And I have a hypothesis that his father may be also from Ningbo, so that would explain these links with the Ningbo community, which were very strong. But there is no contact or mention to his Chinese family, as far as I know. And this is a little bit not disturbing, but maybe he didn't know, or he didn't know who his father was, and he knew that, of course, that his father was Chinese, but there is no mention of it in the diary.
All right, thank you. Do we have any other final questions? I think if not, then what remains for me to do, Carlos, is to thank you so much for taking the time to give us a talk. I think it's a really fascinating case study, and also the sources that you have, of course, particularly the diary, but also the archival sources are, wonderful. It's a wonderful case, and I think we're all looking forward to learning more about the larger project. So thank you very much for taking the time and answering all of our questions. Before we close, I should mention that the last session of the webinar, of the Chinese Business History webinar for this semester, will be on the 12th of May, when Dr. Yan Dong from the Shanghai University of Finance and Economics will be speaking about his research on public debt. So keep an eye out for that. We will, of course, be advertising it as usual. But again, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to Carlos again for presenting your research here, Carlos. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hassan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.